My friends and I live where it's blistering hot in the summer, so we got into kayaking and paddleboarding. It's a natural remedy for the most brutal summer days. Over the years, we've come to a place that we prefer, favorite lakes and rivers, and even events that we come to every year. The water community itself is super cool and tight-knit. They plan all kinds of dope stuff throughout the season. One pretty cool thing that they do in our neck of the woods are the night paddles, and the vibe of the event can vary. Some of these are planned as late-night excursions downstream, wherein a team will travel with minimal light at a nice slow pace, leaning on their skills and each other for support to navigate that terrain. This is considered a pretty dangerous pastime, but the folks that organize it are one in a million and are seriously good at what they do. Even some are search and rescue operators, and they attend these events for training. The other kind of night paddle is more like a rave out in the water. Everybody decks their board out or kayak with all kinds of lights and glow sticks, even glow-in-the-dark paint. There are inflatable rings and rafts full of coolers, speakers, all the stuff you'd need to throw a party. The rave night paddles were more my style. I made sure to attend at least one or two every year. Where we live, even at night, temperatures can be in the 90s, sometimes over 100 degrees. Well, me and some of my friends got invited to one of these, per usual. We all agreed to go. I got my paddleboard all decked out and crafted some glow stick props for the night and prepped all my gear. By the time of the event though, every single one of my friends had canceled. A few had canceled leading up and the rest just bailed the day of. They all had good reasons, I just didn't take it personally, but I was still fully committed to going. Being solo didn't deter me. I've attended several of these by myself, especially later in the summer months. I drove out to the parking lot, secured a space, and then offloaded all my stuff and carried what I needed down to the shore. I wasn't drunk or high or anything. I'd only have a few beers with everybody else once out in the water, as I had to pack up my own stuff and drive myself home, that kind of thing. It was fun, but wasn't a reason to be irresponsible. There are plenty of people in the parking lot along the shore, down the waterway, and more would be showing up every hour. You had to get there almost at sunset to get a decent parking spot. Otherwise, you'd have to drag your shit for a quarter mile just to get to the water. I loaded up my paddleboard and set sail, neon tube lights lighting my way, like a flagship for a good time. I had my own little speaker, a series of lights, some goggles, food, and a six-pack. All the essentials for a good time. Further down the river, I could hear bass and dance music blaring, and soon I poured into the pool. A large, spacious body of water with enough room to fit a good 75 people or more. There were only maybe 20 or 25 so far, but there were girls dancing on paddleboards just like mine, their bodies lit up with every manner of glow stick. I cracked a beer and settled in with my feet in the water, started cheering and whooping to the music. After an hour, the place was damn near packed, brimming with college-age co-eds, floating in every direction. I linked up with a few people that I knew, being such a frequent participant, and soon I fell in with a crowd of folks and just felt right at home. We drank a bit, played a little floating beer pong courtesy of the rave lighting, and danced our asses off to the music. I started getting in the water a bit to cool off and just enjoy the river. At one point, I made a big show of falling backward off my board. It was kind of the punchline to a joke that I made. I fell into the water though, and I felt something weird touching my back and shoulder. It was only there for a second, soft and kind of slick. Then it swam away. I shot out of the water like a bullet, caught off guard by whatever was underneath the water. There was enough light and splashing that any fish or snakes or whatever wouldn't be hanging around this pool. If they were literally hiding near the bottom somewhere. Critters have never been a problem for the night paddles, at least the ones that I attended. It was weird, and I mentioned it, but we were all pretty much just brushing it off. It's a river. It could be anything, even just some driftwood. Regardless, it creeped me out. I decided I just wanted to get out for a second. I needed to take a leak anyway. I explained to everybody that I was going to hit the shore for a minute. They said whatever, and off I went. I grabbed my flashlight and then hopped off my board, just deciding to wade over. I planned on it being quick. I didn't take 5 or 6 steps more before I felt it again. This time it was on my shin. I knew it was something near the bottom of the river. It was moving to get out of my way at this point. Weirded out, I brought my other shin up to bang it off, and it felt like my leg touched an arm or something similar. At this point, I just think it's a massive fish. I kind of got scared because I don't really know. I clicked my flashlight on and pointed it straight down. To my complete shock and bewilderment, I saw a person looking back up at me. He was in some sparse snorkeling gear, but I could make out the goggles, the mouthpiece, even had fins on. I literally couldn't believe what I was seeing. As I started to call my friends over, the guy disappeared deeper in the water. I called out and pointed. The others hit him up with their flashlights too. At this point, the guy knew he was caught. He came up and played it off cool. Everyone knew better though, just started laying into him. I guess this guy had been caught a time or two at events like this. He was the equivalent of a peeping Tom, watching girls underwater, swimming around them without them even knowing, maybe even touching them, who knows. He heard about these little get-togethers, decided it was a perfect place to get his rocks off. The creepiest part to the whole thing, at least for me, was that he would steal people's stuff right off their paddleboards or kayaks, and then hold it for ransom. It's very common for people to lose all kinds of shit, from glasses to wallets and keys, phones, you name it. And for other people to find it later along the shore or places in the river. People have even found wedding rings years after they go missing. Because of this, little groups were created on social media to help return the lost items. After these night paddle events, a bunch of people would post their missing phones, wallets, whatever. This creep would respond because he's the one who stole it. He was the one collecting rewards from these people. I knew a few people who had gotten their phones back from this guy specifically. Women, more often than not. They all claimed that they were pretty sure someone had broken into their phone. Like this guy was prying through their personal stuff, texts, pictures, everything. It's just a grim reminder that you can never be too careful. You never know what kind of craziness people get up to, even in the middle of the night, in the middle of a river. The Pacific Northwest is a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts, and my boyfriend Eric and I are no exception to that. The forests are so lush and dense, it's like walking through a jungle. Coupled with the breathtaking mountains and the ocean, it turns into truly one-of-a-kind area, and many of us just can't get enough of it. Eric and I try to get outside for a few miles at least once a week, and I swear we never see the same thing twice. We met in college, bonding over our shared love of hiking, backpacking, and paddleboarding. If it happened outside, we both wanted to try it. Our adventures had taken us to some of the most breathtaking spots in the region. We've always found that our time in nature just brings us closer together. Having a mutual love and admiration for the outdoors only nurtures the bond that we share, and it's been like that since day one. With that being said, there are some things that we do more than others. Day hiking has kind of become our go-to hobby, thanks to its convenience and accessibility. Paddleboarding is fun, but super involved. Camping is great, but sometimes requires a lot of time. We don't always have that available. The more that we adventure, the more we come to love one-and-done trips that just burn up the miles as fast as possible. We started as a hobby slowly whipped us into shape over time, to the point that we actually had muscles and pretty solid cardio. Hiking put us in the best shape of our lives. We've explored countless trails, each one of them offering a unique experience and a chance to connect with the natural world. So, when we heard about a natural spring at the end of a long but moderate hike, we knew we had to check it out. There are all kinds of waterfalls, forgotten lakes, and lookout points. We hiked to anything that we heard about. The spring itself was rumored to be a hidden gem, tucked away inside this secluded valley. The hike would take all day, but the promise of a serene view and chilly clean water was just too enticing to resist. And all day didn't necessarily mean hard. The trail itself actually had a pretty low rating in regard to difficulty. We spent the week planning our trip, poring over maps and online guides and preparing our gear. Finally, the weekend arrived. We set off early and eager to hit the trail. As we drove to the trailhead, the excitement was building up inside me. I loved the sense of adventure that came with exploring a new trail, and the fact that this one was a bit of a challenge in terms of length only just added to the allure. Eric and I had become experienced hikers over the years. We were confident in our ability to navigate the wilderness, especially here in our own backyard. We'd spent so much time in this area that we used to joke that it was impossible for us to get lost. Once we arrived at the trailhead, I felt this sense of relief and adrenaline at the same time. The parking lot was almost empty, a good sign that we'd have the trail to ourselves. I have a bit of a complex when it comes to our hiking. I don't like it to be a spectacle. I don't like sharing every little step of the path with people I don't know. I know it sounds entitled, but I go the distance to just be alone, not brushing shoulders with people, just trying to take photos. We got our packs together and loaded up on water and snacks and immediately hit the trail. The first mile or so was just stunning, like walking through a jungle. The trees were tall and green, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The trail itself was narrow and winding, but well marked, so we made pretty good progress. But as we hiked deeper into the woods, the trail began to get harder and harder to follow. It splintered off in different directions and in some places seemed to disappear altogether. Eric and I exchanged a look at one point, our excitement changing into curiosity. Bushwhacking a trail was nothing new for us, and we welcomed the challenge. We pulled out our little hand map and took bearing and pressed on. Hard to follow trails aren't really uncommon here, or really anywhere, just a factor of the terrain. Some areas encourage people to wander in all directions, and when this happens, the trail gets diluted, seems to go in every direction. This had been the case in this area, to the point that the main trail turned into a ghost of itself, and we really struggled to follow it. We just pushed on with it and did our best. After another hour or so, we were 99% sure that we'd been successful. The trail seemed to reestablish itself along the correct route, deeper into the valley. Either way, the place was breathtaking. It had my attention pretty much held hostage. I didn't care if we were lost, as the way back to the car was clear as day. It would take miles and miles of unknown navigating for us to not know where the car was. As we continued on the trail, the beauty of the wilderness enveloped us once again. The trees towered above, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. We walked hand in hand, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. There was water somewhere far off, like the echoes of a waterfall, and it was carried up to us. We lost ourselves in the woods, just soaked it in one beautiful step at a time. Soon after this, we found ourselves inside a small grassy clearing, surrounded by 3 or 4 different trails breaking off in multiple directions. A large wooden sign stood in the center, but it was old and vandalized. The letters are faded and pretty much unreadable. This was a rest stop that we've been counting on, as it's well marked online. Everybody said this was the intersection of many different trailheads. One would lead to the spring, one to the riverway, and several just went up towards this jagged rock base that offered absolutely beautiful views. Problem was, we wanted the spring specifically, and without the sign, we didn't know which way to go. "Great," Eric said with frustration etched on his face. "Now what?" I pulled out our hand map, but it really wasn't much help. The trail seemed to twist and turn in every direction. It was pretty disheartening. We both thought the trail would clean itself up and get more defined. Alas, it was more diluted than ever. We had no idea where to go. Just then, we noticed a man sitting on a log across the clearing. Dressed in worn hiking gear, his face was weathered from years of exposure to the elements. We shared a wave, and Eric and I approached him. He smiled pretty much right away, seemed friendly enough. Like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't fond of approaching strangers, but this was pretty much our only option in the moment, so I was actually grateful to see a friendly face out there, especially one that might have directions for us. "Hey there," Eric said, his voice almost jolly. "We're trying to get to the spring. Can you help us out?" The stranger looked up at us, his eyes squinting in the sunlight. "Ah, the spring, yeah. It's a beauty." Eric and I nodded. "Can you get us there?" he asked. Yeah, sure," he said. His face was weird though. He was kind of looking all around, not really making eye contact when he said this. I didn't know what to think other than it was weird. Maybe he wasn't very social. Maybe there was a mosquito buzzing around his face. Who knows? He said he had the directions, and that's really all that mattered to me. "Great," I said, relieved. "We're having a bit of trouble finding it. The trails out here are pretty unclear." The stranger nodded, his eyes alight with a knowing look. "Yeah, it can be tricky, but I can help you out. The trail that you want is the one to your left. It'll take you straight to the spring." He pointed down the trail that he indicated and gave additional direction. "Stay to the left, don't go over the boulder, stay left of that too, and when it forks, follow it uphill, not downhill, even though the downhill side looks more promising." He explained that we had to hike a series of ascending switchbacks that would route the hillside and then right to the spring, which was tucked back in the furthest slot of the canyon. "Thanks," Eric said, his voice grateful. "How far is it though?" The stranger's smile was cryptic in the moment. "Oh, it's not far, just a few miles. You'll see some landmarks along the way. Just keep an eye out for an old oak tree with the carved initials. That'll let you know that you're on the right path." I don't know why, but I felt a shiver run down my spine as we thanked the stranger and just continued on our way. There was something about him, something unsettling that just didn't quite add up. The more he spoke, the less he looked at us. Once he did, he was looking at my legs. It gave me the creeps. I said thanks anyway and followed Eric down the path. Super glad to have him with me. Otherwise, who knows with that guy. He just had that energy of somebody up to no good. As we walked, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees twisting and turning in ways that seemed almost sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on us from somewhere out in the shadows. "Eric," I whispered, my voice barely even audible. "Do you hear that?" He looked at me with his eyes questioning. "Hear what?" "That right there. It's like crunching or something." I could hear it somewhere behind us, inconsistent, distant crunching off in the tree line. It sounded like walking, but I couldn't tell if it was two-legged or four. It stood out to me because we haven't heard or seen anybody throughout this entire time. So a person all of a sudden hiking parallel to us. It's pretty strange. He shrugged, his expression reassuring. "It's the woods, babe. It's normal to feel a little spooked." But I know what I heard, and it wasn't just the woods. Either way, I pressed on, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever was lumbering around behind the trees. There are various predators out here, of course snakes and spiders, and Eric and I have had our fair share of encounters with them. I didn't get the vibe there was any kind of animal like that around though, as the birds and bugs continued to bustle around, making noise. Usually once a predator enters the area, everything moves on or gets quiet. Whatever it was, I was the only one who found it creepy. We hiked for another mile or so, enjoying the terrain and views inside that area. The sun was shining and birds were singing their sweet melodies. But as we walked, that feeling came back, the feeling of being watched. Throughout this time, I kept looking behind us. And that's when I saw him, the man from earlier, sneaking through the brush, following us. "Eric, look," I whispered, tugging on his arm. He turned just in time to see that guy creep back into the foliage. "What is it?" he asked. "That guy from earlier. He's following us," I said, my heart racing. I was sure that it was him. He was a ways off, I'd say a good quarter mile, but the slope we just climbed gave me a great vantage. I pegged him the second I saw him. You couldn't miss those scruffy clothes, that torn up red backpack, same haircut and beard. I mean, he was the only person we'd seen out here. Who else could it be? Eric immediately shrugged it off. He's probably just out here hiking like we are. He has just as much right to be out here as we do. I know what I saw, and I know it didn't feel right. The guy was trying to keep hidden, at a half crouch, sticking close to the brush and branches. I kept a close eye on the trail behind us, my senses on high alert. This is exactly why I don't like hiking with people I don't know. Another mile and we encountered another couple hiking in the opposite direction. To me, for the first time ever, it was a godsend. They were using the trail and going the opposite direction. Looked totally normal. I was relieved to have strength in numbers, just in case that guy decided to pop out waving a knife or something. We asked them how much further the spring was. They looked at us with complete confusion. "You're not on the spring trail," they said. "This is the lookout trail. It gets seriously steep in about a half a mile. It starts to climb up the canyon wall." My heart immediately sank. We've been walking for close to 2 hours and now we're on the wrong trail? We went back and forth with them for a while just to clarify what they were saying and where we were. Super disappointing. Only added more confusion and creepiness to the situation that I believed that we were in. I mean, it's obvious, right? That guy back at the rest stop was not making eye contact with us because he was giving us bad directions, or in other words, lying out his ass. Now, here was the real question. Was he just messing with us, or was he setting us up for something weird? I was grateful for the honesty of the couple, as it told me they weren't involved with that guy at all. "Thanks for letting us know," Eric said, his voice laced with frustration. The other couple bid us farewell and then disappeared around the bend. I gave them a brief warning about that guy down there, just saying that he gave us bad directions and was now coming up behind us. They agreed it was weird and they would keep an eye out as well. Eric and I stopped for a moment, just taking inventory of where we were now, how far we'd gone. I think Eric just wanted to settle and take the situation in alone. I mean, we were out of options. A lot of the day had gone by, so the spring was probably off the table now. We just needed to decide if we were committing to the lookout point or turning back now for something else. We weighed our options for 10 minutes or so, long enough for me to forget about scanning the trail. And that's when we both heard it. The shutter of a camera. It was so jarring that we literally stopped talking and looked back at one another, went pale in the face. I could tell now Eric was suddenly on board with the strangeness I'd been talking about. We both looked up to see that stranger from earlier, hiding behind the trees and branches. He had a camera, and he was snapping photos of us. My blood immediately ran cold. And I know this sounds weird, but shit like this is literally my nightmare. What a weird, creepy thing to do with people you don't know in the woods. It implies a mindset that I can't fathom. When I think about it, it still makes my skin crawl. "What the hell?" Eric exclaimed, his voice angry. He's normally a very level guy, but I could tell he was seething and just ready to go ballistic. "Get away from us!" I shouted, my heart racing. I shouldn't have said anything, but I wanted to match Eric's energy, do my best to get this guy out of here. The stranger didn't move, his eyes just fixed on us with this unnerving intensity. It's not like we were trapped or anything, but we were alone with this guy in the wilderness, and he was within 30 yards now. He never said a single word. We just heard the shutter a couple of more times. "Dude, what the fuck is your problem? Why did you give us bunk directions?" Eric asked. This time, the guy laughed a little, snapped another photo, and then disappeared behind the tree trunk. Remember, this is the Pacific Northwest. The area that we found ourselves in was beyond thick, overgrown to the point of jungle status. Huge leaves, blanketed branches. This guy vanished like a ghost right in front of our eyes. Now we're both officially creeped out, and Eric did not want to go off trail and risk getting injured or something with us being far from the car. We just turned around and started that long slog back to the car. It was something like 4 miles. We took this as a hard defeat, but on the surface, we were just glad to not have anything worse happen. I don't know what that guy was capable of. We didn't hear or see him again after we turned around. We made it back to the parking lot and didn't see another soul. Drove back home and theorized what the hell that guy was about. This all took place a few years ago, and still to this day I wonder why he took those photos, and more importantly, what he did with them. It almost makes me ill thinking there could be photos of me floating around out there, pictures that I'll never see. I know it's a bit of a stereotype, but I've always heard it's hard to make friends as an adult. I never really took this into consideration until I was close to becoming a fat, middle-aged loner. I've lived in that same little community for many years. After the kids moved out, it was just me and the wife. A lot of the guys that I called buddies had moved on to the city, gotten arrested, or didn't have any interest in being friends with me anymore. Suddenly, I had a lot of free time, lots of stuff I wanted to do, but nobody to do it with. My wife and I have our own hobbies and date nights, and namely going to the movies, but in regard to outdoor recreation, I was largely on my own. My wife thinks things like hunting and fishing are gross and archaic. She's a girly girl and I love her for it. About 10 years ago, I did the unthinkable. I made a friend. He was actually a guy I'd known around town, but one day at the tackle shop in town, he and I were just exchanging info in regard to fishing spots and other stuff like that. Decided to plan a trip out together. We've been fishing buddies ever since. My friend's name is Scott, and my wife calls him my mistress. It's pretty funny. Anyway, Scott and I are river fishermen. We hit the lake sometimes, if we have the itch, but for the most part, we stick to the moving water. It's more fun and more isolated. Typically, it yields a better catch, too. I compare fishing a lake and fishing a stream to driving an automatic or a manual. Sure, they both get you from A to B, but one of them is just more fun. This particular trip was just like all the rest. Scott swung by and scooped me up around 5 a.m., just before sunrise. We buzzed out of town and into the woods. There's all kinds of old logging and service roads that cut through the forest around here, and Scott had the wise idea one day to get Google Maps out, see which one got us closer to the river. Not an actual parking lot near the stream, but a place we could park along the road, kind of in secret, then hike back to the water itself. This way, we'd come up on part of the stream that others couldn't access, hopefully tap in a source of fish that were otherwise unknown. Sure enough, he found a perfect little place way back in the woodland, where very few people knew the water cut through at all. "Man, I love this time of day," Scott said, his voice low and gravelly as we drove down that winding road. "The world's still waking up and we're already out here, getting our day started." I grunted in agreement, sipping at my coffee as the darkness outside seemed to press in on us. We'd been coming out here for years at this point, but it never really got old. There's just something about being in motion when the rest of the world is still asleep. It's like I know a secret that I can't share. It's hard to explain, but I've always loved being an early riser. Scott, not so much, but his love for fishing overrides his laziness, so he gets his ass in gear when he needs to. "You know, I was thinking," Scott said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We should come back again tomorrow, before the holiday weekend." "I'd be down for that," I replied, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. but we'd have to find a way to make it work with our schedules. As we drove, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. Scott worked for the town. I owned my own small business, so throughout the week, we stayed pretty busy. Typical old guy stuff, you know. Almost there, Scott said, looking out over the dash. Hurry it up, I joked with them. Finally, we arrived at the spot where we usually parked. It was just this little hairpin of a turnout, barely enough room to park his truck. But very few people drove out this far, and it was still pretty early in the morning. We didn't expect to see anybody until the afternoon, if at all. We took a moment to bundle up in the cab, put our fingers in front of the heater one last time, and take a final sip of coffee before we pushed out into the wilderness. We unloaded our gear and started that trek through the forest, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the trees. We went light, just a couple of creel bags, our rods, and whatever food and water we packed ourselves for the day. It's easier to fish a stream with a light tackle, as you constantly find yourself moving up and down the creek, hopping rocks and maybe even climbing trees, just to get a little better vantage over the water. I love this part, Scott said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's like we're the only two people in the world. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We walked in silence for a few minutes, only sound being the rustling leaves beneath our feet. I personally am not really afraid of animals or the dark, or anything for that matter, but I am afraid of circumstances. That dark trek through the trees was only a little unsettling for me, because if something bad were going to happen, that'd be a damn good time for it to happen at. We each kept a firearm. Most outdoorsmen do, but it wouldn't be any use if the mountain lion decided to stalk us through the dark, or if we accidentally stepped in a snake pit. We did our best just to follow that same little strip of terrain, trip after trip, year after year, and hope for the best. They've been working for us so far, at least. We stumbled along until we could almost hear water, which always put my mind at ease. We were more than halfway at this point. We used this big old ugly tree as kind of a waypoint to let us know of our progress. I lit it up with a flashlight and took in the gnarled old form, that dead gray trunk reaching up in a black maw, the early morning sky. Then, that's when we saw them. A pair of boots unlaced and upright, sitting at the base of a tree. My heart skipped a beat as I felt sweat come to life along my back and forehead. In all the years that we've been coming out to this area, we'd never seen any evidence of another human, not even so much as a piece of trash or a boot print. Absolutely nothing. So to see something so personal out there, it was really weird. What the hell? Scott breathed, his eyes fixed on those boots. He didn't move a muscle. Almost looked like he was expecting a person to jump out from behind the tree at any point. I shook my head, mind racing with any possibilities. Who would leave their boots out here, and why? It seemed like a delicate thing to just leave behind, especially in the dark. But what did I know? They could have been sitting here for a week, never to be picked up again. It gave me this eerie feeling that maybe something had happened to somebody out here. We stood there for a moment, our flashlight beams fixed on the boots. It seemed so out of place, like a piece of a puzzle that just didn't quite fit. Well, that's weird, Scott said finally, his voice low and cautious. I nodded, my eyes scanning the surrounding area. Yeah, it definitely is. We looked at one another, and I could sense the unease in Scott's eyes. But we didn't say anything more. We didn't need to. We both knew this was something strange, something that didn't belong in our little slice of wilderness. We stood quietly and strained our ears for anything strange, anything out of place. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, interrupted only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or small bird, waking up to the early morning light. Let's just leave them, Scott said finally, his voice decisive. Maybe they belong to somebody and they'll come back for them. I nodded, and we continued our trek throughout the forest. Now as we walked, that silence seemed to grow thicker, like a fog that clung to our skin. We didn't talk about the boots anymore. We didn't need to. I know we were both thinking the same thing, that it's something strange, but ultimately, maybe it's nothing at all. After all, it was just a pair of shoes. It's not like we found a severed head or something. Finally, we emerged from the trees and saw the river stretching out before us. It was calm and peaceful, the first rays from the sun glinting off the water like 1,000 tiny diamonds. We stood there for a moment, taking it in. Then we split up, each of us finding our own spot to fish. We didn't go far, I'd say maybe 50 feet or so, far enough we wouldn't have an issue getting our lines tangled, but also close enough that we were both in earshot. As the day went on, we'd move further and further from each other, sometimes a mile or two, just to get all the good fishing that we could. By midday, we'd start working back towards one another, have lunch, and then hit the river for another hour or two before heading back to the truck. As I cast my line into the water, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was what I loved about fishing: the quiet, the solitude, the sense of being completely alone in the world. And yet, as I stood there, I couldn't shake that feeling that I was being watched. I kept an eye on the other side of the river, looking for anything along the bank that just might be out of place. I imagined seeing footprints scampering through the mud, but I didn't find anything. "Hey, Scott," I called out, my voice low and casual. You see anything weird?" There was a pause, and then Scott's voice came back, equally casual. No, man, just the usual, fish, trees, water." I nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. "Yeah, me too." We stood there in silence for a few minutes, only sound being the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. And then without warning, a fish bit my line. My heart skipped a beat, just like it does every time I get a bite, and muscle memory took over from there. Drop, hold, yank, reel. After a few good turns, I knew I had him, biting left, right, down, up, before finally giving up and letting me haul him in. "Yeah!" I exclaimed, my voice loud and triumphant. "I got one." Scott's voice came back, equally as excited. "Nice. Let's see it." I grinned, my heart pounding with excitement. I hauled it up and let Scott have a look, though it was only about 12 inches long. Not a trophy by any sense of the imagination, but it was proof that there were fish here, and they were biting. Good omen, if you will. I got it off the hook and released it, per usual. It's always been a little weird superstition of mine. Let the first catch of the day go, so he can tell the others that we're merciful. The hook is safe to bite. I know it's silly, but just more old man thinking. The sun came up, but Scott and I didn't move yet. Catching a fish that early meant we caught them in the right place at the right time, so we wanted to fish this pool raw before moving on. I cast out a few more times and tried some different jigging patterns, but got nothing. Scott, however, had a couple of bites, and on the third, landed a decent-sized trout, something like 18 inches. I kept my line in, watching as he worked to get the hook free. I wanted to see if he would put it on the trout line and keep it or not. What happens next is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. As I watched Scott work the line and the hook, I caught movement across the river in my periphery. It was so quick and small that I didn't even look over at first, but the moment it stirred, I remember getting this dizzy, almost sick feeling. I knew whatever was moving shouldn't be, and honestly, I think I was afraid to look. It was moving backwards and quickly disappearing in the foliage, and then it all went still. This all happened in a matter of a few seconds. Then, before I could shout any kind of warning, something comes flying out of the brush, over the stream and right at Scott. I thought it was a bird at first. Almost gave me a sense of relief, but as it started to arch back towards the ground, I knew it was an object, a rock or a stick, something like that. It hit Scott right in the chest, and I could tell it scared the shit out of him. He froze up, totally rigid from top to bottom, then dropped both the fish and his rod and scrambled back from the water. "The hell was that?" I hollered over, setting my rod down and slowly approaching. I pointed across the water. "It came from the other side of the river." Scott took a moment to gather himself, then stood up and scanned his little alcove. "I think it was a rock," he said as he looked around. Whatever it was fucking heavy. Our eyes naturally wandered across the water, scanning for anything and everything. I don't pack much heat when we're out there, just this little snub 38 special. Even then, half the cylinder is full of snake shot. If I came upon anything small, I could take care of it, but much more than a coyote, it's probably a goner. Scott, on the other hand, carried his baby out there. A wood-handled stainless steel 44 Magnum. Real showstopper. He kept a hand on it as he was checking the surrounding area. We took another moment to compare notes, and I told him what I saw, and he told me what he felt. Whatever the case and whatever happened, there was nobody to point a finger at. We start entertaining weird theories. Maybe some kind of rogue water current pushed a rock up and it flipped it out of the water. Maybe a raccoon threw one. It was hard to be sure of anything when it happened so fast. We went back to doing really the only thing that we could, fishing the river. This time we really didn't watch the water, just kept our eyes up for anything weird. We stood a little closer to each other this time. I wanted to mention the boots, but I also didn't want to spoil the trip with fears and worries. Kept my concerns to myself and just did everything I could to enjoy the peace and quiet. That would soon only be a daydream, however. I'd say maybe an hour later, I caught little movement. A little disruption across the river that I almost didn't look up for again. Thinking about the incident earlier, I decided to look. To my horror, I saw a sliver of a guy looking back at me. He was shirtless, dirty, barely peeking around the tree trunk across the river. I froze in place and did my best to pretend not to see him. When I let my eyes flip back to the guy, he was gone. Now I knew who threw that rock earlier. I crept down to the way Scott was and nodded to get his attention. He came over and asked me what was up. "I think I just saw somebody across the creek," I said. "What? Fishing?" he asked, agitated. He looked around and started scanning the area. No, he looked like a kid, and he didn't have a shirt on," I clarified. "How old?" Scott asked. "I don't know, maybe 21? We both looked back over the water. I pointed out the area that I thought I saw the guy. There's nothing there. We agreed the whole thing was weird, packed up and just headed downstream a bit. This turned out to be a mistake. Truly, I wish we'd gone the other way upstream. What we found downstream ruined that trip and sent us packing back to the truck. We came around a bend and saw this beautiful pool, one that we fished often. In one of the shallow sandy basins, though, there was what looked like gallons of blood all in the water. Because the pool was so big, placid areas formed along the shores, where the water moved a little less, and so debris or whatever could actually choke up there, much like the blood was doing. We both stopped in place, looked at one another, and just shook our heads. At the foot of that shoreline, I swear to God, there must have been 100 massacred fishes. All sizes, all different species, all gutted inside out. Some smashed to a paste, others were chopped up. They took up the whole shoreline, the water, everything was painted with blood and organs. And the gutted fish showed us that whoever did this was a human. No bear, no eagle, no animal at the time would do this. It just creeped us the hell out. We had a brief conversation, added everything up, and decided it wasn't worth it. We packed everything up, turned back into the woodland, didn't even bother eating lunch, just to hopefully create a little more distance. This wasn't the same route back through the woods that we usually took, so we were a little off course, but still had a pretty good idea of the direction we needed to go. We kept a steady hand on our guns as we walked through the trees, looking over our backs every few feet. As we got closer, though, we had an itch. Scott had mentioned it before, and we both wanted to walk over to the old dead oak tree, see if those boots were still there. It was only 10, maybe 20 minutes off course, So we redirected ourselves and started cutting a path. As I'm sure you can imagine, we got to the tree and there wasn't any sign of those boots. In fact, there's evidence of water in the dirt at the base of the trunk, like a person that was wet from the waist down had been standing there. We knew then that that asshole had crossed the river by foot, had come back and gotten his boots. Chalked it up to a hunter or woodsman just having a rough night. And when we got back to the road, we still hadn't seen anybody else. There was no cars parked near us, so really didn't know what to make of it all. I mentioned calling it in to some kind of agency, but Scott said no. The guy was throwing rocks. He can find his own way back. We left. Never saw that guy again. But I can say that was the weirdest fishing trip of my life. We ended up hearing later there'd been this big college party blowout a couple of nights before. Search and rescue was even called. Some of the guests took hallucinogens, had wandered off, and got seriously lost. We thought maybe it was a leftover straggler from that, but even then, the hell was he still out there, gutting fish by the dozen? Hey everybody, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and dry hump the notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. Stalk me on Twitter or you can stalk me on Instagram. All these links are below. Hey everybody, how's it going? Haven't done an outro in quite some time, but I figured if not now, then when, right? I don't really have much to say, other than, no, this will probably just be a little bit of a ramble session as I think of it on the fly. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I'm trying to think of what's coming up next, and I can't remember. I think it's hunting stories and urban explore. I can't say that fucking. Urban exploration, urban expo, whatever you want to say. I'm pretty sure that those are the next two coming up because I haven't done hunting in quite a while. I haven't done urban expo in a while. I also got another channel kind of cooking up. If you're making it to this part of the episode, then you'll kind of have a little bit of a sneak peek behind it. I'll probably plug it at the beginning of an episode here in the future. But yeah, it's gonna be kind of like Chilling Scares, Mr. Nightmare type of thing. Something with a lot more visuals, because I feel like these true scary stories and stuff that I do here on this channel is fun and entertaining, but it's not scratching all of those creative itches I have. Especially when it comes to like the visual things and creating things that are shorter, but kind of like packing it all in. So that's the plan. I've got everything narrowed down. I've got all the content, at least for 2 episodes so far. So yeah, I'll talk about it later in the future when it's actually launched and everything like that, as well as I'm pretty sure the website is going to be launching here soon. I've been talking about it for a while, but soon as in like within the next couple of days. I'll obviously plug that probably in the community tab and on a future episode at the beginning as well, so look out for that. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, so when this episode drops tomorrow, right? Today's Thursday and tomorrow's Friday. Yeah, I'll be seeing Blink-182 and I cannot freaking wait. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to shut up now. I'm done rambling. I'm done talking about this, that, and the other. And I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you next week for Urban Expo and hunting stories. Cheers.
For me, I really like corn.
What do you like about corn?
Go!